not touching it at this point. I think it's still catching up to where we were before. See the hourglass? Don't you love the hourglass? Oh, now I can't get that arrow. If I go one click at a time, maybe we'll be okay. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, so we're really saving time. All right, now I'm going to take the view and zoom to 150. Okay. All right. Now, how do we know that this fragment, because you can't hardly see the fragment, but I've highlighted the letters. How do we even know it's from Deuteronomy? Here's why. This part, can you see where I'm moving the cursor? Okay. That can only be a bet. That can only be the letter B or bet in Hebrew. In this script, on this manuscript that this was from. This is one fragment from a larger manuscript that's been eaten and torn apart. Okay? So, and there's only one time or 3 times actually, in all of the Hebrew Bible where there's a word that ends in bet followed by emo. Okay? I mean, that's fortunate for us, right? You know where those 3 times are? In the 3 phrases, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Because you have bechalav, right? Bet, emo. Only 3 times. So we know that this has to come from Deuteronomy. Okay? Or it could come from Exodus, but since it's with other Deuteronomy, the scroll at large and other fragments is from Deuteronomy, we make a good presumption this is also from Deuteronomy. But look, there's a letter that follows. In our Hebrew Bibles, it ends with emo. And the next letter in the next verse is not this letter. Now you see that this letter is different. Even though it's broken, this is a kaf. You see how the bottom line is not curved? See how this one is kind of curved? Okay, down here I've done the restoration. I put the chet and the lamed and the bet, chalav, emo, ke. This is how the kaf is made. Notice that the top goes all the way over. All right? And that the bottom line is not curved at all, but straight. That's how they made the kaf. So what would that mean? As, like, which is exactly what the Samaritan Pentateuch has. Or ki, because this is, because, ki. All right? So, I know this sounds not very conclusive, but it's amazing when you find a scrap at Qumran. Now, where are we going to date this? Well, at the latest, it would date to the 1st century BCE, a long time before they started, the Masoretes started systematically making sure that the text was unified. We have a Samaritan Pentateuch, which is early, we have Septuagint, which is early, and we have perhaps something from Qumran, which tells us at Qumran they were writing something more at the end of this line. What would that tell us? Well, I'll give you my bottom line. The bottom line is, I think we can say almost conclusively, if not conclusively, that the prohibition not to boil a kid in its mother's milk related somehow to sacrifices. It did not relate to general food laws. In all of the contexts, we have sacrifices, and particularly festival sacrifices. Now, that doesn't help me explain what the prohibition means. Okay? I could have some suggestions, but now, are you clear on this before I? Okay, at least you understand it as best as I can explain it to you. Okay. So the reason I wanted to put that up there was just to show you that we have more than one witness of an addition to at least two of these texts. Okay? All right, let's go on. For those of you that are into this kind of thing, you can look at the footnotes and there's more information throughout these pages. Now let's go to the bottom of page 14, or the last paragraph, summary. The Samaritan Pentateuch and the Greek translation give witness to an ancient textual tradition that two of the three texts that contained the prohibition against boiling a kid in its mother's milk had an additional line not found in the Masoretic text. It is further very likely that this additional phrase, or one like it, at the end of Deuteronomy 14:21 was known at Qumran, that is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The addition itself clearly identifies the prohibition as pertaining to a sacrifice offered to the God of Jacob. We therefore have very early textual witnesses from two and very possibly three sources that place the prohibition clearly within the sacrificial cult, that is, within sacrifices at the temple. Two of the three texts under consideration conclude contexts which deal with the pilgrimage festivals and the sacrifices offered at the central sanctuary in conjunction with these festivals. The third text is put just before laws pertaining to tithes and requirements to bring the firstlings of the flock and head to the sanctuary. All of them, therefore, are connected contextually with sacrifices at the sanctuary, and the additional phrase found in the Samaritan Pentateuch, as well as the Septuagint and possibly Qumran, at the end of Exodus 23:19 and Deuteronomy 14:21, give further ancient textual evidence that this is how the prohibition was interpreted from earliest times. Now, I'm supposed to be done in 25 minutes, right? 7:30? Okay. So I'm going to continue to summarize, and then I want to have at least some time for question and answers. Oh yeah. I'm sure these kids are just loving it, aren't you? Wow. I'll tell you what. If you can sit through this, you're ready for university. Okay? You are ready. Okay. Targumim, the dating is notoriously difficult. Scholars are relatively undecided as to the date when these Aramaic translations of the Tanakh each were composed. But the Targum fragments found in Qumran give evidence that at least some of the Targumim were extant in the pre-rabbinic era. To what extent the Targumim, as we now have them, reflect their ancient form is also a matter of scholarly debate, but it is universally recognized that the Targumim, these are the translations into Aramaic of the Hebrew text, are not strictly translations but incorporate the various interpretations, Agadic as well as Halakhic. That means telling stories as well as giving legal rulings that prevailed as the Targumim were written and rewritten. Some of the Targumim give the ability to recover the underlying Hebrew text being translated while others do not. All are paraphrastic, okay? They're kind of like the Living Bible, okay? They just take, or maybe even more like the Amplified Bible, okay? So they're paraphrastic. Some minimally, others nearly entirely. Others, it is well established that the Targumim aim, to one extent or another, to strengthen rabbinic halakha when translating or paraphrasing halakhic texts. And this is exactly what we find in all of the Targumim, in Onkelos and Neophiti, in so-called Pseudo-Yonatan, and so forth. They all simply state the rabbinic ruling. Okay? For instance, Onkelos, Exodus 23:19. I chuckled at this when I first read it. The first of your first fruits you shall bring to the sanctuary of Adonai your God. You shall not eat meat with milk. What? That's how you translate you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk? So what do we see? The Targum is already including the ruling, the interpretation of the rabbis. Same thing in Exodus 34. Same thing in Deuteronomy 14. So-called Pseudo-Jonathan or Yerushalmi is very interesting. The beginning of the first fruits of the fruit of your ground you shall bring to the sanctuary of the Lord your God. My people, house of Israel, you have no permission neither to boil, neither to eat meat and milk mixed together, that my anger not grow strong, and I cook your grain, the wheat and the chaff, the two of them together. So, see how it's expanding? It's not just boil a kid in its mother's milk. You cannot eat meat and milk together. You are not permitted, in 34, the Targumim, you are not permitted to cook and neither to eat meat with milk, the two of them mixed together. Now, one thing I didn't, in my haste to kind of summarize, The question is, another question that the rabbis had, can you eat meat and milk together if you hadn't boiled them together? Because it says, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. So as long as you don't cook meat and milk together, in other words, if you cook the meat by itself, can you eat the meat and just put cheese on it? The answer is no. In the ultimate, in the final halakhic of rabbinic Judaism, why? Any suggestions? Yes. Because it boils in your stomach. Okay, so so that gave rise to then, well, if we don't boil it, is it okay? If there's some way we could not boil it, how would that be? Leave 4 hours between, or an hour, depending on which you eat first. Okay? 4 hours if you eat meat first, 1 hour if you eat milk first. Why? It takes longer for meat to digest than it does for milk. So the rabbis suggested that an hour afterwards there's no more milk in your stomach, which isn't true, but anyway, understandable. And so, but boiling becomes the issue. Boiling becomes the issue. All right? For some of them. All right, so if you look down these, you will see that in each one of the Targumim, they have, you shall not eat meat and milk mixed together. I mean, they have already, they're not translating it, they're putting the rabbinic rule into the text. That would be like a Presbyterian translating the Apostolic Scriptures and doing it this way. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, sprinkling water on the head of each one of them. Right? Say, well, no, that's not what it says. It's baptizo. Baptizo means to immerse. But their translation, since they would sprinkle, that's how they would do it. We see the Targumim taking the already decision of the rabbis, putting it into the text. Okay. If you go to page 17, I have something from Philo. Philo was a Hellenistic philosopher, Jewish philosopher, roughly contemporary with Paul, not quite, but close to the same era. And he says, and he was very kind of allegorical, right? Big-time allegoricalist. And he says, and having also given a command that no one shall sacrifice the mother and the offspring on the same day, he goes further and is quite prodigal on the particularity of his injunctions, adding this also, thou shalt not see the lamb in its mother's milk. Notice he says lamb rather than goat, as is the case with the Septuagint text as well. For he looked upon it as a very terrible thing for the nourishment of the living to be the seasoning and sauce of the dead animal, and when provident nature had, as it were, foreshadowed forth milk to the support of the living creature, which it had ordained to be conveyed through the breast of the mother, as if through a regular channel, that the unbridled licentiousness of men should go to such a height that they should slay both the author of the existence of the other and make use of it in order to consume the body of the other. So what does Philo do? Philo simply says, this was to teach us humanitarianism towards animals. The very milk that is supposed to sustain the young should not be used to kill it. That's inhumane. That's Philo's suggestion. And by the way, this humanitarian or life versus death interpretation of the prohibition's meaning figures significantly in the history of interpretation. For instance, Rashbam writes that to eat the meat of a goat cooked in its mother's milk is disgusting, voracious, and gluttonous. According to the same model, Scripture teaches us civilized behavior. Ibn Ezra also adopts this. A number of early church fathers also follow Philo in his humanitarian interpretation. Clement of Alexandria parallels the prohibition with the command in Deuteronomy 25:4, which follows Philo, and teaches that the prohibition of seething a kid in its mother's milk teaches the need for compassion. Some modern scholars have adopted this view as well. Carmichael is one of them, so forth. Now, on pages 19 and following, I've given you, and you might, I could have just told you, look it up in the Mishnah. But when people tell me to do that, I think to myself, especially if I don't happen to have the text that they're quoting, right? I say, well, it's nice that you get to have this huge library with all of these texts. I don't happen to have that particular text. It would have been nice if you would have put it in the paper for me, so that's what I did. I put it in the paper for you in case you don't have your own copy of the Mishnah. And chulin means what, by the way? Yeah. Okay. Right? To slaughter, to how do you slaughter? What are the laws of slaughtering and so forth? And not only for sacrifices, but for meat and so forth and so on. Okay. A drop of milk which fell on a piece of meat, if it is sufficient to part flavor to the meat, it is prohibited. So we see in the Mishnah, and where are we going to put the Mishnah? Well, at the early 3rd century, at least one copy we know was made, at least by tradition, Yehuda Hanasi. But when we'll talk about it tomorrow, okay? But I wouldn't say that there became a known ruling until maybe perhaps later. I don't know. We're not sure. I say at the bottom of 19, the rulings of this Mishnah give evidence of the halakhic debates that inevitably took place in light of basing the separation of meat and milk on the 3 texts we have studied. Paragraphs 1 and 4 of the text quoted above arise from interpreting gedi as representative of all meat, which brings up the question of whether the rabbinic prohibition equally applies to fowl. This also shows that the rabbi struggled to find how bechalev imo, in the milk of his mother, could apply to the halakha of kashrut they were developing, and how the prohibition regarding a kid in milk is to be understood in light of the prohibition of carrion to which it is joined. That is, why did he say, you're not to eat a corpse, not a corpse, but an animal that has died by itself, a carcass? Likewise, the question of how widely gedi should be interpreted in the biblical text becomes a point of the rabbinic debate pertaining not only to what meat can be cooked in milk and if one may derive benefit from them. Does the Torah prohibition as extended by rabbinic halakha refer only to domesticated animals or to undomesticated animals? Okay? Can you go out and trap a deer, with a net, and then kosher slaughter it, and then can you eat that with milk? So the rabbis, and of course, Akiva. Akiva's hermeneutic, right? Akiva and Ishmael? No? Okay. Akiva and Ishmael. What's the famous phrase of Ishmael? The Torah speaks in the language, yes, the Torah speaks in the language of men. Okay? So for instance, as an example, at the very beginning of the Bible, what's the prohibition to Adam and Chava? You shall not eat of this tree, for in the day that you eat of it, and literally in the Hebrew it says what? Mot yamut. It has the word die twice. Dying, you will die. Okay, what is that? Well, in Hebrew, in the Semitic languages, how do you make things emphatic? You put an infinitive followed by a verb. Mot yamut. Dying, you will die. Meaning what? You will surely die. Ishmael says, that's just the language of men. We shouldn't make a big point that there are 2 times that it says death. Akiva says, every time that something is stated, it has a separate meaning. So, dying, you shall die. You shall die spiritually. You shall die physically. Okay, now what would Akiva do with the fact that you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk? What would Akiva do since it's stated 3 times? He would have to say it must apply to 3 different things. It must apply to meat from undomesticated animals with milk. It must apply to meat from fowl with milk. And it must apply to meat from unclean animals. You're not allowed to cook meat from unclean animals. You say, well, why would you do that? To sell it to the foreigners. It says in the very context, there's a carcass, right? You can't eat from it, but you can sell it to the... Well, can you make it more delicious for them? Can you take that animal that died in the field, slaughter it, dress it, cook it in milk, and then sell it to the foreigner? No, you can't do that, according to Akiva, because it says it 3 times. It covers that too. Yes.
So you can sell an unclean animal, but you can't
right, because the prohibition of not cooking a kid in its mother's milk applies to you, but it doesn't apply to them. So you can't cook it. They could, if they wanted to. That's up to them. That would be Akiva's point. Now, Let's hasten on, because this is getting too long. Okay, on page 21, I go to Mechilta de Rabba Ishmael. Okay, so this is the Ishmael that is the nemesis of Akiva. And I figured, okay, this is Mechilta is an early midrash. We don't know how early exactly, but it's early. So I decided to spend more time on it, and I lay it out for you throughout the whole page. I tried to go through and explain it, okay? But let's go to the summary, because we don't have time for it all. All right? Bottom of page 23. I've taken the space to outline the arguments of Mechilta because they cover nearly every aspect of the developed rabbinic halakha regarding meat and milk. Furthermore, this midrash is a good example of how the halakha has derived and expanded by rabbinic logic and exegesis based upon rabbinic hermeneutical rules. It also indicates that in some measure, questions regarding the halakha were still being asked, and Mechilta is a good representation of how the rabbinic halakha of not mixing meat with milk had become a primary focus of the laws of kashrut in the early Talmudic period. What is more, this commentary expounding Exodus 23:19 gives witness to the manner in which the context of Deuteronomy 14:21 had become foundational for interpreting the two texts in Exodus, just as we saw in the translations of the Targumim. So what's my point there? Instead of allowing the two Exodus texts to interpret the Deuteronomy text, the rabbis took the one Deuteronomy text and interpreted the two Exodus texts from it. Okay, Rambam. What did Rambam do? Okay, now remember, Rambam is late, 12th century. Okay, so what did he say? He said it must have to do with idolatry. He says, as for the prohibition against eating meat boiled in milk, it is my opinion not improbable that, in addition to this being undoubtedly very gross food and very filling, in other words, it may not be good for you, it may not even taste good, idolatry had something to do with it. Perhaps such a food was eaten at one of the ceremonies of their cult or at one of their festivals. A confirmation of this may, in my opinion, be found in the fact that the prohibition against eating meat boiled in milk, when it is mentioned for the first two times, occurs near the commandment concerning the pilgrimage. Just as I said earlier, it has to do with going up to the festivals. So Rambam said ultimately, don't do at your festival what the pagans do. They boil meat in milk, don't you do it. Just because the pagans do it. By the way, in recent times in Ugaritic is thought by some to be the language that Abraham may have spoken or something like it. It's an early Northwest Semitic language, like Hebrew, like Aramaic, written in cuneiform originally, found at Rosh Hashanah. There was a text that was found, I'll just summarize this, and there was a big hubbub. I can remember when I was taking Ugaritic and we translated this text, we were just jumping around the room. So finally, we got an answer to this, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Because it said essentially, it's in a phrase called the birth of the gracious and beautiful gods. By the way, this is all pagan. It's nothing to do with the Bible. It's all pagan stuff, but it's early and it's Semitic. So, and in this pagan festival, in this pagan religious festival, here was the command, cook a kid in milk, a lamb in butter. I thought, oh yes, there it is. The pagans sacrifice doing this way. That's why we're not allowed to do it. Problem, we were translating from early photographs, and the photographs weren't great. When new photographs were made, and I have all this, Bruce Zuckerman is the primary one who did it, and I actually talked to Bruce and said, tell me, is it true? He said, absolutely true. The new photographs of the tablet in question have given ample evidence to the fact that whatever the line read originally, the reconstructed text cannot profitably be used as parallel to the biblical prohibition against boiling a kid in its mother's milk. In fact, it probably says something like, cook a kid and eat it with lettuce. Something to that effect. It does not have chalav. It's an entirely different word. So, even though Rambam tries to do the idolatry thing, there's no evidence whatsoever that cooking meat in milk was a particular pagan custom. I wish we could find some. That would be great, but we can't. Okay? Okay, I'll do that in just a minute. Just let me finish this up. Just a minute, let's finish this up. So, we're now surveying and coming to the conclusion of summary of the whole thing. I go through the first, on page 25, the first ones are giving the minutiae. I mentioned that there are three texts, that all three texts have to do with sacrifices, the prohibition was given on and that there are additions to some. Those are the summaries. Okay, they all deal with festivals. They appear to all deal with sacrifices. There are some additions in ancient texts that seem to clearly link this prohibition with sacrifice. In surveying the interpretation on the next page of the three texts containing the prohibition, we found the following options: that on humanitarian grounds, that is, to take the life-giving milk of the mother and boil the meat of her suckling young in it, was to act cruelly and inhumane toward both mother and offspring. From this perspective, the prohibition was given to Israel to foster civility and decency, and if toward animals, how much more towards one's fellow man. The problem with the humanitarian interpretation is that the Torah clearly allows the slaughter of a suckling on the 8th day and onward, which hardly would seem to comport with the notion that slaughtering the suckling was inhumane. Moreover, the mother goat can in no way be aware that her kid is boiling in her milk. So the prohibition does not seem to be given as assuring humane treatment of animals. A second, a widely held interpretation is that the prohibition is to be grouped with the often found Torah prohibitions against illicit mixtures. This perspective would include those who see boiling a kid in its mother's milk as an illicit mixing of substances that present life and death. Now you just turned the page. I have a different pagination than you. How is that possible? Do we have the same file? I hope so. One wonder. By the way, one thing I skipped over. Some have said, and these are people that raise goats, say that when a female goat gives birth and her milk has come in, that there are what they call bee stings in the milk, which are little spots of blood. And some have suggested that that was why. But it doesn't say you shall not boil a young kid in its mother's milk, in the first 3 or 4 days. Because, after the kid is a month old, the blood spots in the milk go away. Right? So, different mixtures doesn't seem to be the issue. A third category of illicit mixtures, Labushani, who proposes that in the first days after giving birth, the milk of the mother goat or ewe lamb has spots of blood in it, bee stings. And you can look back and see, I give you the information on that. But I don't think, if this were the case, the milk from any animal nursing its young contained blood, then one would expect not only the cooking of meat in it to be prohibited, but also any use of this milk for eating and drinking. Why doesn't it say you may not drink the milk of a ewe that has recently given birth? Right? In other words, if it has blood in it, it's prohibited. It doesn't seem to be the point. Number 3, a view held by some is that the origin of the prohibition was to guard Israel against adopting a pagan concept of magic. It is proposed that in some pagan cultures, boiled milk and even meat boiled in milk was thought to have some kind of magical power or cosmic significance. But this suggestion seems to go far afield from the biblical context themselves, and clear literary examples of connection between boiled milk and magic in the ancient Near East are questionable. 4, we also saw that suggesting the prohibition was grounded in the repudiation of pagan sacrifice ritual, and actually we discovered this has no historical grounds whatsoever, even though you will still find commentators, older commentators, that hold that view, because they haven't they haven't gone back and studied their Ugaritic and looked to see what's come about in the last 10, 15 years. When we come to the rabbinic literature, we saw how the Deuteronomy text became the lens through which the Exodus texts were interpreted. This was made clear in the rendering of the Targumim as well as the Mekilta and other Midrashim. It is also clear that in the Mishnah compiled in the last half of the 2nd century, the prohibition of cooking meat in milk, and by extension eating meat with milk, had become accepted halakhic, rabbinic halakha, though even in the Mishnah we saw some matters of debate upon which the sages were not in full agreement. regarding whether or not you could eat, the meat of a fowl with milk. The fact that variant rulings regarding whether meat and milk could be placed on the same table where people sat to eat is reference to the houses of Hillel and Shammai should not be uncritically accepted as proof that separating meat and milk was the standard practice in the pre-destruction era. Since it is common for later rabbinic authorities to attribute their own rulings to earlier authorities, we should be very careful about presupposing that what we read in the Mishnah necessarily describes halakha in the pre-destruction era. And if anybody wants to disagree with me, fine, but I just remind you that the rabbis say that every discussion between Hillel and Shammai was enunciated to Moses on Sinai. Now, they didn't believe that. All right? No, they did not believe that. They knew that that was not the case. Why did they say it then? Because they needed to find a way to give Mosaic or divine authority to the oral traditions. Right? They needed to have, they wanted it to have authority, to have teeth. How better to find teeth in their rulings than to say God gave it? Well, we shouldn't point our finger too much. There's many charismatics today that would say, God told me. Now, are you gonna say, no, God was wrong? When somebody says, God told me this was true, that's the slam dunk, right? That's the ace. What can you say? If God said it, it must be true. The question is whether He actually said it and whether He said it to you. We also saw that the primary arguments contained in Mishnah Chulin 8, and particularly as demonstrated in Mechilta, are built upon rabbinic interpretation and argumentation which goes well beyond the basic meaning of the biblical text. All right, finally, we get to the conclusion. This is my conclusion. I've given you 28 pages of data, okay? Go do your work and find out what you think. The prohibition against boiling a kid in its mother's milk, found 3 times in the Torah, clearly pertains to sacrifices within the central sanctuary as part of a festival celebration, and in connection with the bringing of the first fruits from the ground and the firstlings of the flock. This is made clear by the context in which each of the 3 occurrences are found, as well as the language of the prohibition itself, namely, the use of gedei rather than basar, flesh or meat, or equivalent terminology, the use of bashal, to boil, which comports well within the context of Israelite sacrificial service, and 3, imo, its mother's milk, which narrows the original focus of the prohibition to a cultic framework. That is, I'm using the word cultic in its social, normal sense, that is, relating to a ritual of religion at a given sacred place, which would, of course, been the temple. Given the fact that the biblical prohibition is clearly attached to the festivals and festival sacrifices offered at the central sanctuary, the question that confronts us is this: why, in the emergence of rabbinic Judaism, did the injunction against boiling a kid in its mother's milk become entirely removed from its sacrificial context and interpreted rather as pertaining solely to kashrut or food laws? While the answer to this question is shrouded in history, I would like to suggest some possibilities. First, we know that following the destruction of the temple and subsequent failure of the Jewish revolt under Bar Kokhba, the rabbis of Yavne began the process of transferring key aspects of the temple service to daily life within the synagogue communities of the diaspora. Right? So why is traditionally are there 3 synagogue services? Shacharit, Mincha, Ma'ariv. Why? Those are the 3 temple offerings, right? Why do you have the bima on a raised platform? Because it's to remind us that you go up to the temple. Same with the ark, right? You go up to where the Torah is interpreted. So forth and so on. You have a lot of halakha transferred from the temple. You have a ner tamid, you have an ark, right? Everything that relates to the temple. All right. In the same way, they transferred the enigmatic prohibition not to boil a kid in its mother's milk to the food laws. In other words, we can't now apply it because we're not having sacrifices at the temple. This is just a suggestion. How do we maintain this commandment that we no longer have sacrifices? If the commandment was originally related to sacrifices, what can we do? We can bring it into our normal food. The prohibition was removed from its biblical context and transferred to the realm of food laws with ease, since in Deuteronomy the injunction comes at the end of a context enumerating food laws. The fact that the prohibition as found in Deuteronomy became the primary basis for interpreting it as a law of kashrut by the rabbis is seen by the fact that the Mishnah and the Targumim, as well as Mechilta, consistently have Deuteronomy 14:21 in view as representing the summation of the 3 times the injunction is found. In other words, the Deuteronomy text, with its inclusion of the food laws, becomes the lens through which the injunction finds its rabbinic interpretation and kashrut halakha. The developed rabbinic halakha, which took the prohibition against boiling a kid in its mother's milk and transformed it into a central halakha of kashrut or food laws, also served an additional purpose. For in the emerging rabbinic Judaism, the need to mark distinction between the synagogue and the emerging Christian church became increasingly important. The complete separation of meat and milk as an essential element of kashrut made social interaction with non-Jews via table fellowship a near impossibility. And you know it, right? Any of you who have separated or do separate meat and milk, you can't go just eat at any restaurant. You can't just go eat at anybody's. We've now, my wife and I twice have hosted David Rubin, who was the mayor of Shiloh in Israel, and he stayed at our house. Well, he's Orthodox halakha. How can he stay at our house? We have one refrigerator. We have one sink. What do? We go to the store. We buy a brand new styrofoam ice chest. We fill it full of ice. We buy paper plates, paper cups, paper bowls, plastic spoons, forks, so forth and so on. We take everything that he's going to eat and we put it in that chest. Nothing goes in that except his food. And everything that goes in there is textured. So, I ask him, do we need to do something special to our table? He says, no, it's fine. But he wanted to make sure that everything that was in that styrofoam chest didn't go into our refrigerator. I said, no, it didn't. Okay? So, in other words, he can't just go stay with anybody. He has to stay with somebody who follows his same kosher rules or someone who will accommodate his kosher rules. The same thing would be true of, now just consider for a moment, I'm preaching here a bit, just consider a moment, now you have the inclusion of Jews and Gentiles coming into the body of the Messiah. Whoa. Now what do we do? Well, we know this was a problem, right? Peter said, yeah, I'll eat with you, come on. Then some people came up from Jerusalem and said, Peter, what are you doing? And he said, sorry, I can't eat with you anymore. Right? Table fellowship was an issue. And it continued to be an issue in self-identification by the time we come at the end of the first century and the second century. The emerging Christian church said, we're not them, and the synagogue said, we're not them. Now, we don't want anybody to confuse us. Just because we use 3/4 of the same Bible doesn't mean we're the same. We're definitely different. We know this is the case, right? We have it in rabbinic tradition that originally on Yom Kippur they knelt on the floor and prayed. But why did they change? Why on Yom Kippur in traditional synagogues do they no longer kneel on the floor? Because that's what the Christians do. Originally in the Siddur there was the reiteration of the 10 words. But now it's not there. Why? Because that's all that the Christians reiterate. That's all they say. They say the 10 words. We don't want to put that in ours because we wouldn't want anybody to think we have cut the Torah down to 10 words like the Christian church did. All right? So it's like the Democrats and the Republicans. Right? When you ask a Democrat, what does he believe? He says, not what the Republican believes. And vice versa, right? We define ourselves as not them. Okay. Were meat and milk strictly separated as a standard of kashrut in the pre-destruction era? The answer seems clearly to be no, even though the later Mishnah attributes such concerns to sages living in the pre-destruction era, such as Hillel and Shammai. That the Mishnah would portray Hillel and Shammai as concerned with kashrut aspects of a prohibition, which in the original context of the Torah pertained to the sacrificial service, agrees with a not uncommon phenomena of the later rabbis attributing their newly formed halakha to early authorities in order to give it great weight. And look at footnote 66. Jacob Neusner writes, an ample evidence in virtually every document of rabbinic literature sustains the proposition that it was quite common for the sages to make up sayings and stories and attribute the sayings to or tell the stories about other prior authorities. Now, you may argue with Neusner on that, many have, but it's an interesting concept. The conclusion of our study then is that separating meat and milk as a matter of kashrut is not based upon the written Torah. The long-standing separation of meat and milk as a standard of kosher food is entirely an enactment of later rabbinic halakha. Okay, first I'm going to answer this lady's question, and I think your question was about why do the rabbis say you can eat fish and meat together? Was that your question?
No.
Oh. Okay, you can have fish according to rabbinic halakha, rabbinic Judaism. You can eat fish with milk. Fish is not meat. According to rabbinic standards, fish is not basar. Fish is parv. It's neither meat nor milk. Mayonnaise is too if it's made correctly. If it doesn't have a D next to the hechsher, right? Right. Mayonnaise is eggs, essentially, right? Eggs and oil, right. So, and tahini too, right? I mean, in Israel they take that, well, my wife does the same thing. You take the sesame seeds and whatever else, forget what it is, but you blend them up and it makes a white, like sour cream. And if you put lemon in it, it tastes like sour cream. So, you can use that, you can put that with a meat dish, no problem, from the rabbinics. Now, I don't have any problem putting it on meats. I don't have any problem with sour cream, because again, I've taken the position that, and I'll leave you with this. My position is this: if the rabbinic halakha simply restates what is found in the Torah, great. I will do it, and I will try to do it in the traditional way. Why invent something new, right? Okay. If the rabbinic halakha goes contrary to the Torah, as Yeshua said, by your traditions you've set aside the commandment of God. For instance, if the rabbinic halakha says, I can't eat with my Gentile brother in the Lord, I say, forget the rabbinic halakha, I eat with my Gentile brother because this is what the Torah tells me to do, right? Because we're one, okay? If the rabbinic halakha is neither a repeat of the Torah nor contrary to the Torah, but neutral, then I say, I can take it or I can leave it. But if I take it, I can't require you to. I can't say, you're doing something wrong if you don't do it my way. Which is, by the way, the question of how do you tie tzitzit? Well, maybe in a chavarah like this, you've come to a conclusion. Your leaders have said, let's tie our tzitzit this way. Okay, fine. Well, then submit and follow. That's fine. But if there's not a standardization, then nobody can point at you and say, oh, you're wearing your tzitzit wrong. Why? The Torah doesn't tell us how. It just tells us to wear them. Okay? As long as we know what they are, that we look at them, we remember the commandments, that's what we're supposed to do. Okay, so your question, your answer to the question is, the reason that meat and milk, the reason you can have lox and bagels is because, lox is not meat. Yeah, it's fish. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would say ask your local rabbi. Because it's, in our situation, we look to see how in our own location, when we have local chickens and local turkeys, I've inquired as to how they're slaughtered and whatever. Guess what? They're slaughtered in a kosher manner. They're upside down. Their neck is cut off. The blood is drained. And why? Because in Washington, you may or may not know this. 10, 12 years ago there was big salmonella problem. Several people died, and they made a state law. The health department made a state law that slaughtering of chickens had to be a certain way. And so actually, even though it isn't hechshered, even though it doesn't have a hechsher on it, as far as I know, chickens and turkeys that are grown locally and slaughtered locally are fine. Blood has been drained out. Yeah. Yes, sir.
As I'm reading through the mitzvah, I get kind of the feeling that there's separation going on.
Yeah.
Clothing, as far as the material that's used in clothing.
Right.
We have a separation of things that are grown.
But okay, let me interrupt you here. The only thing that's separated in clothing is linen and wool, and I think there's a good reason for that. I mean, I think the text is quite clear why. Because this is required of the priests. The ephod is made of linen and wool. In other words, you're not to take for common dress what is special for the priest, for the high priest. So that's why it's prohibited. Because you're not prohibited to mix, say, cotton and wool, or cotton and linen. Okay? There's no problem there. Go ahead.
Well, this is, again, as I'm reading, I'm seeing kind of a separation.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a separation of Israel out of Egypt.
Sure. Light from dark.
Exactly.
Yeah. Sabbath from work days.
So I see that as being inconsistent
Right.
with other themes.
Right. Okay. Good. Yeah. And it could be, I would be comfortable with the idea that God simply said, do this, and we don't know why. But I would still say that it doesn't relate to food that you eat. It relates to sacrifices, if we look at the context. Yeah. Okay? Well, I only went over a few minutes. Any other? Okay, tomorrow night, if you want to come back for more, tomorrow night we're going to be looking at this whole question. I have a provocative title for tomorrow night. What version of the Mishnah did Paul read? Okay? King James. Okay, I like that. Okay, no more questions or comments that you want to make? All right. By the way, if you didn't get a copy of the paper or you want to give it to somebody else, it's up on our Torah Resource website, and if you just go to Articles in English, it's right there. You can just download it and away you go. Okay? All right. Very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Tomorrow we're going to have, as I mentioned, some of you may have not been here when we first started tonight or today. Tomorrow for the third day of the pre-conference, we're going to have to change the beginning time just due to the, of course, to the funeral that's going to be taking place for our elder Yaakov. That's for those of you who didn't hear about that announced time. That is going to be taking place tomorrow at 2:30, and that's going to be at the Moran Cemetery. We did send out an email to everybody on our email list, so you should have that in your email as far as the address, and there's a link to for the directions. So if you'd like to join us for that, we encourage you to do that. The conference will not start until 5 o'clock tomorrow because of that. With that being said, feel free to fellowship and have a good time. Oh, Harel in the back there.
This is my own curiosity. Due to the change of schedule, is tomorrow night still going to be the three speakers? Is it going to run that much later, or is there going to be a modification?
Good question. Yes, there will be a modification. We had our first speaker as Max. We will have to reschedule that. I think we're in the process of talking to him about that. Did you get a chance to talk to him, Reuven? Okay. So yes, we have different options for him, and that would be one, either after Oneg Shabbat, we can have plenty of time for him to teach what he's going to teach. No problem at all. And we'll have lots of people here, hopefully, for that. Or tomorrow night after, we'll have our teachings up until our Erev Shabbat service that we have here at the synagogue, and then afterwards from 9 to 10 probably, but that's kind of late. So I'm thinking on Shabbat after Oneg would be better, so everybody can get to bed at a normal time, and those who are traveling are going to get home at 12 a.m. So yeah. come join us for service tomorrow. I think a lot of people from coming for the conference will be here as well. So I think that's we'll talk to Max. We'll do whatever he wants to do, but I'm thinking that likely it'll probably be after the Oneg on Shabbat for that. So with that being said, we'll still have our other teachers, and that'll start at 5 o'clock with Rabbi Aharon, and then also Tim Hegg after that. And then we'll have our Erev Shabbat service, which we also encourage you to join us for. All right, well, feel free to, as I mentioned, continue to fellowship, ask, pepper the teachers with your questions. I'm sure they'll be happy to have more discussion with you on everything that's been taught tonight. And I thank all of our teachers and everybody for showing up tonight. Thank you very much.
We really need to spend time in prayer as the four of them. We have decisions that we have to make relative to next year. Whether the few of us are going to be able to maintain another set of classes for addition to the first 2 years. In other words, we need more teachers. And so we're praying desperately the Lord will open the way for that. We've just got to talk through what we can handle, and so we're probably just going to hang out this part until that. But I don't want you to think that we're not interested in what's going on here. Yeah, I agree. Okay, completely agree. We'll probably have plenty of people. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Are you leasing this? We're leasing it. Was it originally a church or what was it? Yeah. Is there a basement? You can always start here and start here and when you get too big for this, you'll probably have two other